You're now live.
We are live. That's always good to know. We're back and we're going to start today with Elcar again sent us a letter of concern or just asked us to take a look at the Code of Ethics and Policy, Investment Advisors, Code of Ethics and Policy on Vulnerable Adults. This was a rule that went through. Senator McDonald, can you give us a little more in depth about what Elcar's? I think you're my only member on Elcar.
Senator Bray and I serve on
Senator Bray
Elcar.
is. Okay, well, either one of you, what was the concern, or both
I
of
do
you?
not have the text of the letter before us.
It is on our web. It is on our website today under the agenda.
One of the curious things we found was that the people whose ethics were, they were deciding what their own ethics were and recommending them. So, but that's not an adequate reflection of the letter that's on the website that I could not recite to you today. But perhaps the witness has taken that into account in what he plans to present to us.
Okay, Senator Bray, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't have that letter open. So the letter was very carefully written. So I'm going to defer to the letter. I mean, I think in part we saw a chicken and egg problem, and so we'll get the more formal version.
Okay, well, for anyone else, the letter is there. I did read it. And we have Bill Carrigan from DFR with us. And Mr. Carrigan, the floor is yours. I know the letter's on the website and also your testimony is up there for anyone that wants to follow along.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate the opportunity to come in and respond to the letter that was provided. I have provided written testimony, so I understand that's on the site as well. I was going to read through it here and obviously then answer some questions if there are any, if that's okay with the committee.
That's fine.
Okay. So I'm going to apologize. I'm getting to that point in time where I need one set of glasses to see things really far away, and then I need another set to see things close. And the close one is probably going to reflect a little bit here, so I will apologize for that in advance.
That's okay.
Again, we thank you for the opportunity to present DFR's views relating to the questions posed to this committee by the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. Specifically, I will address the two areas of concern raised in the letter, which involve a couple of aspects of our regulation. First, contained in our recently amended regulation is the requirement for a code of ethics to be established and maintained by state registered investment advisors. And this was at VSR 7-6A3. Second is the pre-existing requirement for state registered investment advisors to establish and maintain written policies and procedures reasonably designed to ensure protection of vulnerable adults from financial exploitation. And that's located at VSR 8-4H. Before diving into the details, however, I would like to eliminate any confusion that might arise from the Elcar letter. Violations of either of the regulatory provisions above are subject to DFR's jurisdiction, and if warranted, enforcement action.
Okay, Mr. Carrigan, you were kind of fading in and out and we're getting that echo effect. I don't know if you can adjust your microphone or.
I'm actually not I'm using the microphone that's in my computer. I don't have
Yeah, sometimes if you just if I move back a quarter of an inch, no one can hear me.
Okay.
And I tend to do that.
Okay, so is this better if I'm
That is much better, yeah.
Okay. So I'll address the section on the vulnerable adults, which is
No, you're fading in and out again. We had somebody else this morning have trouble from Montpelier. Maybe we'll blame it on the internet.
Well, I'm in Essex right now, so hopefully it's better. Is this better if I do it this way?
Yes, That's
Okay,
much
so
better.
I'll try this. I won't look at you, but I'll just look at my page.
That's okay.
Okay. So VSR 8-4H regarding the protection of vulnerable adults from financial exploitation was added in the 2016 amendment of our securities regulation and was a North American Securities Administrators Association model rule. This regulation has been in place and functioning as it was intended since 2016. This NASA model rule has also been adopted by over 30 other states. We receive written reports from firms when it appears that there may be a potential situation involving the financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Firms are also required to report to the Adult Protective Services in Vermont as part of this mandatory reporting requirement. We have received a handful of these reports since 2016 and investigated each incident as appropriate. Further, the department has regularly required specific information from all registered investment advisors on this topic. We have an annual investment advisor questionnaire process whereby we require information from advisors about different areas of their business. This questionnaire is essentially the equivalent of a desk exam, and a full and truthful response by firms is mandatory. In 2019 and 2020, we specifically posed questions to our registered firms, asking if they had established written supervisory procedures regarding the financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. We also asked as to whether they had identified any incidents of potential financial exploitation, which they had not reported to the division. We have not received any responses that have indicated that there are firms that do not have these procedures in place. Also, we have received no responses from firms that have indicated that they have had experience or they have had experienced an incident of potential financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult that had not been previously provided to the division as required. Nor has the division received any consumer complaints or other information that would lead us to believe that changes are necessary in our oversight on this topic. As it relates to VSR 7-6A3, which is the Code of Ethics, the recent amendment of our securities regulation contained a requirement that state registered investment advisor firms establish, maintain, and enforce a written code of ethics that at a minimum includes I, a standard or standards of business conduct that the investment advisor requires of its supervised persons, which must reflect the investment advisor's fiduciary obligations and those of its supervised persons. 2, provisions requiring the investment advisor's supervised persons to comply with applicable state and federal securities laws. 3, provisions requiring all of the investment advisor's access persons to report and the investment advisor to review their personal securities transactions and holdings periodically. 4, provisions requiring supervised persons to report any violations of the investment advisor's code of ethics promptly to its chief compliance officer, or provided the investment advisor's chief compliance officer also receives reports of all violations, to other persons designated in the investment advisor's code of ethics. And 5, provisions requiring the investment advisor to provide each of its supervised persons with a copy of the investment advisor's code of ethics and any amendments, and requiring the investment advisor's supervised persons to provide it with a written acknowledgement of their receipt of the code and any amendments. Violations of these requirements are subject to oversight and enforcement by the department under existing law 9 VSA 5603. It is worth noting that Vermont is the first state in our region that is imposing this requirement on its state registered investment advisor firms. Neither New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, or Rhode Island currently has a requirement for a firm to have a written code of ethics. As a division, our oversight of compliance with these requirements will be regular and thorough. Initially, when a firm applies to the division to become a state registered investment advisor, there are certain physical documents that are required to be submitted as part of the application process. The Code of Ethics has been added to the list of required documents and is subject to review by a division examiner prior to the firm being approved to do business in Vermont. We also intend to add a question to our annual investment advisor questionnaire, which is sent to all state registered investment advisor firms, regardless of domicile, in late spring, which asks if the advisor has a written code of ethics. They will also be required to provide a copy of that document to the division. We'll also be requiring firms to disclose any notices of code of ethics violations as outlined in 7.6A.3.4 of the regulation. We would also require further documentation related to any violation that they've identified. When the division conducts examinations of a state registered investment advisor firm, whether that be on site or remote, the firm will be required to provide the division with a copy of the firm's code of ethics. We feel that the level of oversight just described is more than adequate, and further would note that the department has the resources to take corrective actions if necessary. One thing I would also like to mention, we had a footnote as it relates to the code of ethics, that there is an existing requirement for investment advisor firms that are under the jurisdiction of the SEC, and those would be firms with over 100 million in assets under management to have a written code of ethics. And that is, the requirements there are similar to what the requirements are here in our regulation. And that was pretty much it on the written testimony. One other thing I would just like to address that I believe Senator Bray, or perhaps it was Senator McDonald, made a comment as it relates to the firms essentially, kind of putting this document together on their own. That's pretty much how things go across the board, whether it be a FINRA member broker-dealer firm or an SEC-covered investment advisor. They're part of their procedures and policies are to establish policies and procedures which reasonably are designed to supervise, and provide supervision to folks. So they don't have a specific set of requirements or items that need to be included. And just as a point of reference here to maybe make a little more sense, we have roughly 70 state registered investment advisors in Vermont at any given time. We lose some to the SEC because their assets under management go above the $100 million threshold. We have others who, for whatever reason, may drop from SEC jurisdiction to state jurisdiction. All of those firms are very different, and their business models are also very different. So it would be impractical to essentially feel that there could be a template boilerplate code of ethics that would work for all the firms, because they're all different. I'll give you an example without naming names. There is one firm that's located up here in Chittenden County who all they do is provide investment advice. They have no custodial relationship, which means they don't execute any transactions. They have no access to client money. They have no assets under management. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is we have firms who have discretionary authority over client monies, which means they could move them and buy and sell without notification to the client ahead of time. They have multiple advisors. They have multiple custodial relationships. The code of ethic requirements for both of those firms, you would imagine, would be very different, because the potential risk exposure is very different in those two different types of firms. So I don't know if that specifically, Senator Bray, kind of addresses what you had mentioned, but whether it's the SEC or FINRA, when it comes to these type of requirements, firms are required to put together meaningful disclosure documents or policies and procedures to address the areas of concern and the potential risk exposures that they have depending upon their business. If we go in there and feel that they are inadequate, we can, obviously, we're going to look for corrective action, which would be, doing something a little bit more in line with what your business model requires. And short, if they decide that, if they represent to us that they've done that, and then we go back in there and do an examination, we could take an action against the firm for having inadequate written supervisory procedures. So we do have, for lack of a better word, the teeth to enforce this. Just to give you some background on the division, I've been in the securities industry myself since 1993. I held a variety of NASD/FINRA registrations, including supervisory registrations. Two of my examiners are also former FINRA examiners. So there's a lot of industry experience within the division. We have an excellent rapport with our state registered investment advisor firms. And quite frankly, our state registered investment advisors are not our problem children. That's not where we have issues. So anyway, I'm open to answer any questions that anybody may have.
Okay, Senator Bray.
Thank you, Mr. Kerrigan, for that additional information. Good to see you again. I think probably one thing to be helpful, just so that I articulate this more clearly, is to just quote briefly from the letter, and then maybe we can talk about that. It may be that the letter doesn't reflect something accurately, or maybe it does, but so if I may, Madam Chair, I'll just read a brief section. Let me see. Further, there could be violations of an investment advisor's code of ethics or written policies on vulnerable adults that might not be reported to DFR's security division or subject to its regulatory oversight. By way of example, from Deputy Commissioner William R. Kerrigan, if an investment advisor receives a complaint of a violation of its code of ethics pertaining to the possible financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, it must be reported to the DFR Security Division. But other complaints of violation of the Code of Ethics may not come to the attention of DFR's Security Division unless a complaint is filed directly with DFR Security Division, or the violation is addressed in a subsequent desk audit of the investment advisor by DFR's Security Division. So I'm wondering if what's being highlighted there is an obligation on the part of advisors to refer a complaint of violation when the exploited individual is a vulnerable adult, but no such obligation exists if it's not a vulnerable adult. Am I reading that correctly?
Well, I understand your question, but just so we're clear, up until the time the regulation went into effect, there was no code of ethics requirement. So I can't go back and talk about the past because it was not a requirement as it relates to having a written code of ethics. And I think we also need to ensure that we're not commingling two things that are completely separate issues. The code of ethics requirement is one thing. The financial exploitation of vulnerable adults is something separate, and was a separate NASA model rule that, again, was adopted back in 2016 when we first came forward with the regulation. We haven't changed anything as it relates to the financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. It's a NASA model rule that has been in existence here since 2016 and is also in place as it is here in Vermont in 30 other jurisdictions. So as it relates to the financial exploitation, there's a mandatory reporting requirement on behalf of firms. And that's something that we have the ability to check annually. And I think I mentioned that previously, and maybe I should give you a little bit of background. 6 years ago, I initiated a new process in the securities division. I wasn't the deputy at the time, but I pushed for this when I was the Director of Examinations and Enforcement. And it was the utilization of an annual investment advisor questionnaire that is the equivalent of a desk audit. Okay, some of you with financial services background, you may be familiar with what I'm talking about. We send it out to all the firms. The interesting thing with this document is it enables us to specifically target areas either of importance, or maybe there have been some red flags, or maybe this year, obviously, there's some new amendments to our regulations. So we're going to want to make sure that we're getting compliance with that. We send it out annually, normally at the beginning of April. And the reason that we do it at that point is every investment advisor firm has an annual requirement to do an amendment to its Form ADV. An annual amendment that's done has to be done within 90 days of the end of their business cycle. The majority of our firms here are calendar year. So by the end of March, they need to file this annual ADV amendment. The thought was we would kind of dovetail with that so that it's not an undue burden on firms to have to go digging up all of this information another time. So we send it out. We have the ability to ask for things very specific. It's not the same document that goes out every year. Some portions of it may be the same. But already for 2022, when we send it out, which is for calendar year 2021, we're going to ask if the firm now has a policy or has written supervisory procedures and a written code of ethics. We ask whether or not there have been any indications of financial exploitation of vulnerable adults that has not been reported. And we've asked that in as it relates to financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. We asked that in 2019. We asked it again in 2020. So we do have the ability to, to ask about those things. In addition, we have periodic cycle examinations where we also double check on that information. So it's something that obviously is first and foremost in our minds, because we understand, we have an aging population, which is why we were the first state in the country to adopt this NASA model rule. We also have the ability to invoke higher financial penalties on firms if they are found to be in violation, especially as it relates to the vulnerable adults piece. So I think that, since 2016, it's been something that we've put a lot of time and effort into and are on top of, and will be the same way with Code of Ethics now that it's in place.
Okay. Let me see if I've got what's happening correctly. The LCAR was concerned because you've asked securities firms, businesses, to write their own code of ethics. And a part of that is anybody that was informed of a violation or, supposed violation against a vulnerable adult was required to report it to DFR. Committee was concerned because that's kind of having the fox guard the hen house. They were going to write their own. And if somebody could have 50 violations against the non-vulnerable adult, and there was no requirement that they report that. Well, now what I'm saying is what I'm hearing you say is that this requirement for code of ethics is new. We're the only state in New England so far that's done one, but that there is a whole foundation of rules and regulations and inspections and ability to go over, forms, and that keeps that allows you to keep a very firm handle on what these firms are doing, and you have the ability and you use it to go after wrongdoers. Am I?
That's correct. The one thing I would just, it seems that we're we're combining two things that are actually separate and distinct. So the financial exploitation of vulnerable adults really has nothing to do with the code of ethics.
Right.
I don't know how we ever kind of got to the point where we were combining. They're two completely separate, and different things. The way we handle financial exploitation of vulnerable adults is through the implementation of the language that was adopted in 2016, and that's separate and distinct. And yes, we've been, as I mentioned, we have had referrals. We get referrals from the firms. We investigate them. We do what we need to do. The model is working exactly as it should. The code of ethics is something that's different, and the reason that a firm is allowed to essentially author their own code of ethics is because they know their business model.
Mhm.
And we outline what those code of ethics need to maintain or have contained in them at a minimum.
Okay.
And we have that.
So
And
you
one
do
of
have
those,
guidelines.
yeah, we have those are the guidelines that I mentioned. There's 5 different provisions, and one of which is to identify and document any potential violation of the code. And then we'll be asking for that as part of our regular annual investment advisor questionnaire process, especially in the first few years when it's new. But this is, brand new for firms. And as I mentioned, we're the only state in New England that is doing this. So
Okay.
we're trying to be proactive and trying to move things forward to protect our investing public.
Okay, Senator Bray. And then
Um,
I saw Senator Hardy, I believe.
Thank you. So in that section I read, I think, so the vulnerable adult population and referrals seems like it's proactively addressed in a forward-looking way on the state of Vermont. I think what that paragraph I read was citing was in part that there's not and please correct me if I'm wrong, and that was that there's not a similar requirement for a reporting requirement for when a investment advisor is aware of a violation of the code of ethics when it does not involve a vulnerable adult, but some other client who's not classified as vulnerable. Is that a misreading of what we learned in LCAR, or am I misreading the letter? That's what I thought the second half of that paragraph was getting at.
Okay, and that's I'm going to apologize, Senator. I'm again going to go back to the fact that I don't know how those two things got melded together in the first place, because they're two separate things.
Okay.
So the short answer to your question is, if there is a potential violation of the Securities Act and within a firm, and there's a complaint, right, a client complaint, the firm has to document that, and they have to put that on their, on their firm records. They don't necessarily have to advise the division of the fact that they received a complaint. Just like when a broker-dealer firm, a Morgan Stanley, Smith Barney, or whatever, gets a complaint from a client, they don't necessarily have to go ahead and advise FINRA, who is their regulator. It depends if it rises to a certain level. And quite frankly, here, one of the things that we do a lot, and I personally do a lot, is pre-COVID, was a lot of outreach where I was all throughout the state providing seminars with AARP and with all different kind of organizations, imploring people to visit the website. If you have an issue, reach out to the division, file a complaint. We do receive complaints, and we are able to recapture, significant amounts of money for Vermont investors, and that's part of what we do. As it relates to the code of ethics piece and the way it differs from the vulnerable adults piece, is the vulnerable adults piece, as I mentioned, has been on the books since 2016. There's a track record. People are aware of it. They know it's there. They do what they need to do, because they can also get into some other problems or trouble with that as well. and that they also report to APS. So we work with APS on those situations. As it relates to the code of ethics, there is a requirement within the provisions that require that the firm document and then investigate, obviously, instances where there has been a violation of their internal code of ethics. So it's not like they come up with them, but they don't need to make sure they're being enforced. It's actually quite the opposite. They have to come up with them. They have to be meaningful for their business model and for the potential areas of risk exposure that they may have. And then they have to ensure that they are implementing them and that they're being adhered to by individuals within the firm. And if there's instances where that's not happening, they need to make an internal record of that. They need to document it, and we will be asking for that on an annual basis. And if we see issues, obviously, then we can go ahead and potentially do a targeted exam of that firm, around those areas where it looks like there's some potential exposure. I hope that makes sense.
Okay. Senator Brock. Oh, no, I had Senator Hardy, then Senator Brock. Okay, so Senator Hardy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kerrigan, for your explanation. I think I get it and the difference between the two areas, but you partially answered this question, but the definition of vulnerable adult, I'm assuming that there's a sort of cross-reference between the definitions for financial purposes and health and welfare purposes.
That's what we use is the statutory definition of vulnerable adult. We don't have our own.
You don't have your own. So it is the same, and it would include senior citizens then as well. You mentioned that.
That's the big
So
one.
do you work with Dale on this area in case there are violations? Do they get notified? And likewise, do you get notified if there's some crossover?
We do, and I actually sit on a committee with them for that exact purpose, because there was a time when there wasn't a lot of cross-reference and sharing of information. So I am on that committee with them, and have worked with them for a few. In fact, just last week, I think in the mail, got the fact that I'm appointed to the committee again, and I need to complete some paperwork to get to them. So yes.
Oh, good.
Short
Maybe
answer is
we'll
yes.
have to review your appointment. Well, that's good to know, because I know especially in, we hear stories out in the world about, especially when it comes to nursing homes and financial management for senior citizens in long-term care facilities and stuff. So I'm glad there's that communication happening. Then in terms of the other issue, the ethics code, you sort of alluded to this in terms of the training you do with organizations, or used to do, maybe you still do via Zoom. Are there requirements in the code of ethics for individual firms that they train their employees and their investors on their code of ethics? So they don't just get a copy of it and say, here it is, but really have training about what it means?
So the short answer is no, there's nothing in there at this point as it relates to them having to mandatorily provide that training. We would normally have conversations with firms and because they ask us what best practices are. So best practices obviously would be to have that communication, and the way the provisions are written, they would have to have those sort of communications with their registered folks in order for them to be able to comply with the requirements of the provision. It's not included in there. So no, the short answer is no, it's not included in there. But conversations that I have, we're not a gotcha, quote unquote, gotcha regulator. We try to be proactive. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of us with industry experience within the division. So firms reach out to us a lot and ask us what our thoughts are on certain things. Before I got on this call, I received an email from one of our firms asking me to review their financial planning agreement to make sure that everything is good and we don't have any issues with it. So that's certainly something, obviously, especially now that it's a new requirement, we would have those communications with the firm and strongly advise that they meet with their internal, because I view their employees to be essentially internal clients too, in a certain way, and to go over that and review it and make sure everybody understands it.
Okay.
Hopefully that
Just in the
helps.
future, requiring that training might be helpful because a lot of times people have different ideas of what is ethical.
Oh, I understand.
And we wouldn't want to have people violate it inadvertently or, intentionally. Either way, it's bad, but inadvertent violations because people have different lines of ethical lines might, anyway, you get the picture. Just training is
Totally
always good.
understood. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that
Yeah.
feedback. It's appreciated.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you.
Senator Brock, and then I'm going to see if I can move us along. So,
From your testimony, I get the impression that the concept of a state mandated code of ethics, at least in New England, is unusual. But I'm wondering how what we're doing here differs from what the SEC requirements are for codes of ethics for registered investment advisors.
Actually, Senator, it's not much different at all. The only difference is that back, I believe it was in 2005, is when the SEC made it mandatory for firms to have a written code of ethics.
Yeah.
None of the states, to the best of my knowledge, and I serve on a number of project groups within NASA, which is the North American Securities Administrators Association. I didn't want all of you to be excited that I was like a rocket science NASA. I'm good. I'm not that good. I serve as the investment advisor section chair for NASA too. So I oversee that section throughout the country. We are the only state that I'm aware of that has implemented a written code of ethics. A lot of states suggest to firms that they have one. A lot of compliance consulting firms who work with startup IAs recommend that they do it, but we're the only one at this point that's actually requiring it as part of our regulation. But it's not really different at all, Senator, between what the SEC is requiring.
Well, my question, of course, then becomes one that there's a mandatory requirement for certain classes of folks to produce annually this SEC required code of ethics. Do you, at the state level, have access to being able to get a copy of those codes if you request it from someone who's registered for the state, and then also to have any access to reports relating to violations of it?
So the short answer, Senator, is yes. And I'll give you an example of a new firm wanting to start here in Vermont. There's a number of things that they do on the IARD system, which is the Investment Advisor Registration Depository, part of the CRD system. So there's a number of documents that they complete electronically there, which we have access to. We actually require that they provide us with a number of other documents, such as an affidavit of activity from Vermont. Are they already providing investment advisory business to Vermonters prior to being registered? Our current rules allow for a de minimis of 5. So they could be providing investment advice to 5 Vermonters, and whether, if they're located outside of Vermont. If they're domiciled in Vermont, they have to register before they have client 1. So we required that affidavit to come in from all of them. We also require a copy of their privacy policy. And now this new code of ethics requirement is going to be required prior to them being approved. So they're going to have to provide that to us ahead of time. Can we require that annually? Yes. And we're going to do that through our annual investment advisor questionnaire. So on an annual basis, the firm is going to have to provide us with a copy of their written code of ethics and or any amendments. And the code of ethics also requires the firm to document and resolve any potential instances of a violation of their code. And we're going to be asking for that as well. And that'll all be part of the tool that we utilize. I mentioned the investment advisor questionnaire. Every year when we get that back, we score the responses, and that helps us to determine our risk-based exam targets for the following year. This would be something that would be factored into that. And if we see, red flags with that, that could also target or have us go out and do perhaps a targeted exam maybe just on books and records, maybe not everything, maybe just books and records to see where some of the issues, may lie.
Well, I can understand the issue of those investment advisors who have a small number of people that theoretically fall below the radar. But of the larger firms, I'm just wondering that if every state adopted what is being done here, isn't it in fact duplicative of what's already being done, is already being required by the SEC? These kinds of codes of ethics, although mandated, I think it was 2004, the larger firms have had these in place since the 1960s.
So I guess the best way to respond to that was, and I know you have industry experience and you're familiar with this. A number of years ago, the threshold for an SEC registered advisor was 25 million, and state jurisdiction was from 0 to 25.
Mhm.
About 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that now, maybe 2008 or 9, the SEC, along with NASA, moved that threshold up to 100 million. So now an investment advisor that has assets between 0 and 100 million would register at the state. 100 million and over would be SEC. So for those advisors that are 0 to 100 million, they don't have a code of ethics requirement because they don't fall under the SEC's jurisdiction, with the exception of 2 states, Wyoming and New York, because they still don't have their own examination programs. So at this point, code of ethic requirements for state registered advisors essentially does not exist, and because they don't fall under the SEC's jurisdiction. It would be up to the individual state. And we are the first, as far as I know. I could be wrong. There could be a state that has implemented it, in the interim. But in checking with our local folks here in New England, none of them have that requirement. So it just doesn't exist there. We're the first ones. We were also the first state in our region to implement the financial exploitation of vulnerable adults model rule as well. So we're trying to do what we can do to kind of stay out in front of this while still maintaining an environment that is conducive to people wanting to, open up an advisor firm here in the state. Personal opinion, like I mentioned, I've been in the industry for a long time. There's a lot of folks in Vermont who could really use the services of a quality investment advisor who has their best interest at heart. So I tell folks, look, you want to come here, you want to do business the right way, love to have you. There's a lot of folks here that can utilize your services. And as long as you're going to do business the right way, great. If you're going to come in here with any other ideas, you're going to get to know me probably a lot better than you'd like, and things aren't going to be great. So.
Okay. Committee, we got one more topic. I think what I've heard is it isn't as simple as somebody can come in, write their own code of ethics, get a slew of complaints about violations from non-vulnerable adults, and essentially get away with it, which it's a little over the hill, but I think that was the concern, because things were being taken out of the whole other context of federal regulations and other state concerns. I'm going to leave it to the committee. You can go home and think about this. If you think of something you might like to change or alter, let me know, and we'll see if we can find a vehicle. First, we'll run it by Mr. Carrigan and get his take on it. But at this point, I want to thank you, Mr. Carrigan, for coming here. These are taking, regulations kind of one at a time without seeing the whole world of regulation. I think this has been helpful.
Great. Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. If any of you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And I can share one other thing with you real quick. I can tell you that there is absolutely no shortage of people doing stupid things all over. So there's plenty to keep us busy, but feel free to reach out if I can be of any further assistance. And thank you again for this
Okay.
opportunity.
Thank
Great.
you. All right, committee. I guess we have a training at 4:30. But I had asked Senator Hardy. She and I had a discussion, lunch last week sometime, and about what this committee's responsibility is going to be for in that totality of the weighting study, what areas we're going to be looking at. And so that I think can give us some focus, because this is one of those things where parts starting in the House and parts starting in the Senate, and we just have an unusual number of those this year. There seem to be major issues, some of which may not even have a bill at this point, that are kind of parked part here and part there, which is making it a little difficult. I'm going to go on the faith that it will all come together like good sausage making in the end, and we will have a great feast. But I asked Senator Hardy to kind of walk us through where we need to be focusing and what our job is going to be as part of this weighting study. So, Senator Hardy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. I know it's late and we have this thing at 4:30, so I won't take a lot of
Yeah, but
time.
you got a break.
But what I really want to, I will explain to you what sort of portion of the pie we've been assigned by the chairs and leadership, but also want to hear from you what information you need to be able to make a good decision. So for a variety of reasons, this committee is taking the lead on the two big options that were presented, whether we go with changing the weights or going to this other option of a cost equity model. And I can go into the details of what that is, but
The cost equity is essentially a grant, right?
similar.
It's a hunk of cash.
It doesn't have as many strings attached, and
Yeah.
it's done by formula. So it's not an application kind of thing, but it's like you take the same pupils that would be weighted and provide a direct payment rather than a weight. And there are differences in how that impacts tax rates and education spending and the education fund and equalized pupils and all that. And so there are differences in those, but those are the two big options that the task force presented. And we're tasked with making that decision as to which direction at least we want to go. And underlying that decision is some of the smaller things that that impact the size of the weights and also or the size of the cost equity payments. One of that is the additive versus multiplicative, and whether or not we want to stick with this combination of adding and multiplying. This is super exciting. I already see Chris's eyes glazing over. We spent like 3 hours going over math, and I would be other Chris, Pearson. And yeah, so the math part of it, and then the way we define and measure poverty, and whether or not we want to stick with SNAP or move to free and reduced lunch, and then later move to the income universal income form, which is also related to universal school lunches. So that decision sort of is nested under the bigger option decisions. And then there's the transition mechanisms, because this would impact school district spending and school district tax rates and how we transition over the next few years. And then the evaluation mechanism, which is near and dear to Senator Brock's heart, but also mine, and certainly super important to know whether or not we gained what we thought we would gain with this. I already have on my list that Senator Bray would like more information about the definition of equity, and I think that's super important. I can pull up the conversation that we had as a task force and share it with all of you, and we can talk about that more. And I think that's really important for the evaluation mechanism, how we're defining and evaluating equity. But I would really like to hear from you, like how deep you want to dive. The task force dove super deep. I'd rather not go all the way down there, but how much information you need, who you want to hear from. We are already scheduled to have Brad James in on Friday to start talking about what the weights do and the impact of the weights. We can also have Deb Brighton in to talk about the cost equity payments and how they differ. But what do you need and want to hear so that I can work with Faith and Senator Cummings to get things scheduled?
Okay, Senator Pearson.
I guess I'll just say up front, it's really hard for me to answer that question because I'm starting at zero. So I don't know what I don't understand or need as a resource. But I do have one question, which is, is the piece that's starting in Senate ed also coming here, or and in a related question, are we imagining doing this as a committee bill and then also that, or just help me understand the interplay?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there are a few pieces that are starting in Senate education. The largest one of those pieces is the English language learning grant proposal. That would come to us afterwards because it impacts the education fund. So they're going to take a first pass at that, then it would come to us. There is no bill drafted at this point for any of this. So we would have to do a committee bill, and either they could do a committee bill or they could just attach it to our committee bill, depending on what they decide. They have a few other smaller things, one of which is the small schools grants, but that actually kind of flows out of some of the decisions we would be making. So that would come to us for sure as well. And hearing that you're starting from ground zero helps to know what we're going to need. I
think we can assume that everybody is starting from ground zero. I don't think anyone on this committee has spent extensive years on education. In my 2 years there, weighting never came up.
Okay.
Well, schools grants did, but not weighting.
We can do sort of weighting 101. Brad will be happy to do that. But I didn't want to condescend to any of you if you already know it and make it seem like you already. So I can tee Brad up for that, and that's where we're going to really have to start, because you're going to have to understand the difference between how a weight impacts things versus how a cost equity payment.
I think that might be the place we need to do the deepest dive, how a weight impacts schools and school funding, and how an incentive payment may have different effects, and that will help us work our way through it.
And I know that nobody has any free time, but if you do have a chance to at least skim the report, it would be helpful. That all the recommendations are laid out fairly clearly, and then there is a section that talks about the weights and the cost equity payments and the difference between the two.
Those would probably be
reading that before Friday would be helpful. And that would lead to some questions.
Probably lead to a good night's sleep tonight. Everybody else, but that last 15-minute break was it for the day.
Right.
And while we're going through this, I do Senator Bray. I saw all these pop-ups that Faith was emailing me, and she's given us a little scheduling issue I need to talk with you about before we leave. So, Senator Bray.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know that the weighting study group worked hard on the report, which I have not read yet. So I was going to say,
But you just got the climate thing to read.
I have two 260-page reports, and but at any rate, I'm happy. I want to read it, but I don't know where it is. So rather than me fishing around, can you tell me exactly where to go?
I can send it to everybody as the actual report and the link. I did send it to the full Senate, but that was a while ago, and I can resend it this evening and tell you specifically the sections that would be good to read by Friday, like give you homework. And please, if anybody wants to have an offline conversation about something I'm happy to do that, or text me, call me, whatever.
Okay.
Oh, Chris, sorry, go ahead.
So is that the final report? Because I also remember there was like a draft, and so part of me was saying, okay, read the final, not the intermediate, but this is a final report.
It is the final report. We passed it in, I think it was the 12th of December, and it's the final report.
Sorsha sent it out about the day it passed. That I think was a Friday, and it may have not gotten sent out till Monday. And then Ruth did send it to us a couple weeks ago.
And we'll get Faith
on
our website too.
Yeah. And I have a feeling Faith may be sending it to you as we speak. So
okay. But they say it takes 4 exposures to sell something. So here I am.
Yeah, we are.
Thanks, Chris.
Did I see, was it Senator Sirotkin's hand? I saw one other hand.
Yes, it was. I'm not
Can't
sure
hear you, Michael. You got to get closer.
I'm not sure this is on point, but my ears perked up when you talked about universal school meals and farm to school. I'm just wondering, is that part of this, or could you give a 30-second update where that is at this point?
Yeah, it's not directly part of this, Gesundheit, Senator Pearson. It's not directly part of this, but what the reason it's relevant is because the measure that's used for poverty is the free and reduced lunch measure. And then we make a recommendation to move to a universal income form, which is what would be necessary if we move to universal school lunch. My understanding is the universal school lunch bill is still in Senate Education. Is that true? Or is it over in the House? It's
House Ed.
Education. It's in House Education.
Okay.
Basically, and just if I can jump in, if we have universal meals, the fear is parents won't fill out the free and reduced meals form, and that tracks other stuff. And so actually they go together nicely, because this universal income form would solve both problems.
Yeah, and we got a lot of testimony from the hunger advocates, or whatever, the food advocates, Hunger Free Vermont, etc.
Hunger Free Vermont.
They really love this proposal that we have in our report, because it would use this universal income form, require it, make it better, and then it would be linked to not only universal school lunches and helping move that forward, but also be used for defining students living in poverty for the purposes of providing school funding. So it's kind of a win-win. This was something that the task force worked really hard on, and hopefully everyone will. Yeah, anyway, I of course think it's a good idea, so I hope everyone else does too.
Okay. All right, Senator McDonald.
Could you restate the question that you asked us at the beginning, before Senator Hardy shared what she has shared?
I don't remember it, Senator. I think it was my usual, any information you'd like. This is the areas that we are being asked to look at as part of this bill. It is starting in the Senate and going to the House. So this is what we need to do before crossover. And there will be, I think this will probably go to House Ed or Senate Ed, and Senate Ed will probably send us some things. This needs several traffic directors. So we will have Brad James, and we will just start through with weighting 101, what it is, how it impacts school funding, tax rates. And then we will go back to, if we go, another way, how that and who the winners. But I think the study committee said they didn't look at winners and losers until the end. They wanted to do this based on the right thing to do. I'm hoping we'll do the same thing. I think since we're much broader scope, most of us will have some winners and some losers. Chittenden County might be the exception just because but that's more English language learners. So
No, they
that,
have
and that's
both.
not us.
Chittenden County has the both extremes in
The
their
both
county, more
extremes,
than any
okay.
other county.
Maybe we will have a reading of Solomon in Slicing Babies, because I went through that with consolidation, and half my school districts wanted us to mandate it and half of them wanted us to do away with it. And I kept saying, so how do you want me to slice this one? So
Who has the sharp knives?
that's right.
Which
So
is the-
anyway,
Madam Chair, just one
yes.
more thing I want to add. We did just get an updated memo with additional numbers. We
Oh.
got it late last night from the report authors. I think it's already been posted to the task force website. I will
Okay.
send it along. I have literally had no chance today. I've been in meetings constantly, but that is not as relevant to us yet until we decide which direction to go. But it certainly will impact the work of the Ed Committee and
Right.
their ELL
This
discussion.
is further analysis.
Yep.
Okay, we now have 11 minutes. In all these emails I've gotten from Faith, I think there were 3. And Faith, you can join us for this. There was a suggestion that because Tom Cavet's time is so tight when he's talking to us on Friday, that it might be beneficial for the committee to listen in. I'm assuming this is all on Zoom, to the e-board presentation. You will
Senator
get
Cummings, that can be done after our meeting in the evening tomorrow.
in
before our
the
meeting.
evening.
It will be on a live stream and recorded, so people don't have to do it while it's happening.
While it's on. Okay. I hate to ask people, I mean, can you fast forward it on live stream? I mean, what we essentially have is 2 economists each one going through their kind of section of the joint presentation. Each one frequently having cartoons, but since there were copyright issues with cartoons, less frequently. So it does tend to get a little long, but it would be helpful because we're talking 2 half-inch thick documents under normal times, or 1/4 inch maybe thick. So I guess, yeah, I was going to volunteer that if you all wanted to sit and watch it together, we could squinch up Cannabis. But if it's possible to watch it another time, and I assume, if you've got questions, but I guess, I know, I'll throw that out to you. We've got an 1.5 hour scheduled for the Cannabis Report because that's what Bryn Hare said she needed, and she has done it for Ways and Means. It was longer than I would normally give. I thought she was just going to go over the fees, but And we could move her back and put the other bills to another day. But if it's all the same to you, we'll just keep the schedule the way it is. And I'll have to read the cannabis report on my own. Okay. All right. I'm giving you 7 whole minutes to get to the next meeting, but I think we can go off live stream.